You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by PayPal. You had plans for the last days of summer. And back-to-school shopping has its own plans. School supplies, dorm essentials, your list doesn't stop. Neither does the spending. But when you pay in full with PayPal, you can pay over time. No interest, no fees. Check out with PayPal and get back to summer. Subject to approval. Learn more at paypal.com/payinfor. PayPal Inc. NMLS 910457.
Pros trust the Home Depot for heavy-duty storage solutions for any job site or garage. Right now, get up to 15% off select storage and organization, impact and water-resistant totes, and shelving built to hold up to 2,500 pounds. Storage systems have space for all your tools and protect them in the garage, on the job site, and everywhere in between. Save time and maximize efficiency with adjustable shelving customized to your business's needs. Shop and save on pro-grade storage at the Home Depot. How pros get more done.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 270, War at Sea 41, part 8, The Operation Begins. This week, a big thank you goes out to Dylan, Mitchell, and Xavier for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. After months of discussion and planning, on May 16th, the Bismarck was fully prepared for its first wartime operation, which was scheduled to begin at midnight on May 18th. During the last 48 hours, there were hurried actions taken to complete the final steps that were essential to making the ship as ready to fight as possible. This included a good cleaning of the fuel oil bunkers, which would be done on May 17th. This was one of those operations that was important for the overall range and performance of the ship, because over time, fuel oil would leave a sludge at the bottom of the bunkers. This reduced the overall capacity of the bunkers and reduced the effective range of the ship, making a bit of cleaning an important part of giving the ship optimal performance. This cleaning was done by bringing in barges that would take on all the fuel oil and then the sludge. With that important work done, the Luftwaffe would also play its role in final preparations by reporting in on what was known of the Royal Navy. The key point of interest was the fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow, which was the primary fleet base for the Royal Navy in the North Sea. Reconnaissance flights were able to report that there were 2 battleships and an aircraft carrier at anchor in the flow. One of the final actions taken before the start of the operation was at a meeting between Admiral Lütgens and the 2 captains of his ships, Lindemann for the Bismarck and Brinkmann for the Prinz Eugen. They were handed a special key for their Enigma machines, which had not previously been used, adding what they believed would be an extra bit of security. Finally, when they left port, there would be just under 2,200 men on board the Bismarck and 1,600 men on the Prinz Eugen. With that many men aboard 2 ships, rumors were of course all over the place around what the ships were doing and what their operation would entail. On board the Bismarck, Captain Lindemann would make an announcement once the ship was at sea. Quote, "The day that we have longed for so eagerly has at last arrived. The moment when we can lead our proud ship towards the enemy. Our objective is commerce raiding in the Atlantic, imperiling England's existence. Let us hope that we are mightily successful. I know it is, has been, and will remain the crew's sincerest wish to participate successfully in Germany's final victory. I give you the hunter's toast, good hunting and a good bag." The first step in the journey was for the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen to join together in the Bismarck Sea near Rügen, where the 2 ships were joined by 3 others as well. 2 of these were destroyers, the Z-23 and the Friedrich Eckhold, and then there was also a merchant ship. These 3 smaller ships were escorts for the larger vessels as they worked their way through the narrow seas between Norway and Denmark. The biggest concern was the possibility of mines, and the merchant ship was kind of the last line of defense because it sailed in front of the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen in the hopes that it would trigger any mines that were missed by German minesweepers. They made the journey into the North Sea between March 19th and the 21st, and once out into the sea, they would be alert for the next major step, and that involved the possibility of air and submarine attacks. Both of these were always possible in the North Sea, with the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force always being quite active in the region to try and find and attack German ships. After entering the North Sea, Lütgens was faced with his first real decision of the operation because there were two paths that he could take. The first was to make best possible speed to a rendezvous with the tanker Weisenberg, which was positioned directly north, in a position which was perfect for a quick tanking stopover before moving directly into the Atlantic. The other option was the more cautious and slow approach, which was to instead pause for some time around Bergen to allow the Prinz Eugen to be refueled there. By the time that the ships would reach Bergen, the heavy cruiser would have burned about 1/4 of its fuel, and this meant that it would not have enough fuel remaining for the high-speed run that they wanted to take into the Atlantic. This is a great example of the downside of the short range of the German heavy cruisers. Obviously, the Germans would never just let them run out of fuel and sit on the ocean, but they pushed everything around them towards specific choices, due to always having to consider the fuel situation. In this case, it would be a major reason that Lütgens would decide to pause at Bergen for refueling instead of heading north immediately. There was another reason, though, which is a bit more difficult to explain. This was the fact that Lütgens had become convinced that the operation was already compromised, even at this incredibly early stage. This also pushed him towards the Bergen option because it was theoretically the path that would give the German ships sort of a path into the Atlantic as quickly as possible. They could go directly from Bergen towards the Denmark Strait, instead of heading further north to meet up with the Weisenberg, which would give them more distance between where they were tanking with the tanker ship and the Atlantic. The cause of Lütgens' belief that somehow the operation was already compromised is not precisely known, mostly because Lütgens would not survive the operation to tell us, which is probably a good point to note that there are many things here that we're going to talk about the overall course of the Bismarck's operation that we just don't know. There would be some officers that would survive the sinking of the ship on the 27th of May, but not all of them, and many men would not. And so this means that there are things that we simply do not know about the actions of the Bismarck, or more importantly and more accurately, the reasons that some actions were taken, because Lütgens specifically did not survive. All we know in this case is that Lütgens did want to refuel at Bergen and that he requested another set of flights over Scapa Flow to get the latest intelligence on the state of the Royal Navy. Lütgens' belief that the British already knew about the operation was a pretty pessimistic view to have, but he was not completely wrong, and the British had been piecing together information over the previous days that painted a picture of the Germans being up to something. They, of course, did not know exactly what was happening, the British didn't, but there were a few pieces of information that led to actions for them to gain more information. One of the pieces was the fact that the British had the ability to read the Luftwaffe Enigma messages, which meant that they knew that there were reconnaissance flights that were going to happen and had already happened over the Denmark Strait. There were also reports trickling in from assets in the Baltic region, which kept an eye on naval traffic with the goal of reporting as much German activity as possible. Reports from those assets pointed towards some kind of commerce raiding sortie, and there were a limited number of ships that were available for that kind of operation. None of this information was perfect, though, but it was enough to justify reconnaissance flights. Flying Officer Michael Suckling would strike gold when he was able to get high-resolution photographs from his reconnaissance-configured Spitfire of the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen and its supporting ships near Bergen. The British got really lucky here because Flying Officer Suckling would take his photos just hours before the Bismarck was planning to leave Bergen. This was because there were weather reports that pointed towards there being the correct mix of bad weather in the Denmark Strait at the correct times if the German ships started moving in that direction quite quickly. As I mentioned last episode, the goal was to move through the strait during a period of cloud, fog, or generally bad weather to cut down on the risk of being spotted or of an air attack. The Bismarck and Prinz Eugen would also benefit from fog while they were near Bergen, because as soon as the spotting report from Flying Officer Suckling was received, a flight of 6 Whitley and 12 Hudson bombers were prepared for a strike. But when they arrived, They were met with a target area that was completely covered in fog. They could not see anything. So they just kind of blind bombed or blind dropped their bombs and went home. These bombs did little damage, but they did, hurt the water real bad near Bergen. It is impossible to know if any of the bombs would have hit any of the German ships if they would have been able to see them. There's kind of a mixed record with British bombers trying to hit German ships, especially if they are underway. But the fact that the German ships had moved away during the hours it took for the bombers to arrive meant that a low risk to the German ships became a no risk to a German ships, completely by coincidence. Online shopping is so convenient, but a professional-looking website is not always a legitimate business. You may place an order, enter your credit card information, and only later discover that the store was completely fake. The product will never arrive, and criminals may now be able to use your payment information for additional purchases or fraud. Coveron provides a comprehensive bundle designed to help protect your identity, online privacy, and financial information. It includes cyber insurance for eligible covered incidents. If fraud does happen, Coveron offers up to $2 million in recovery support for qualifying expenses and financial losses. You also can receive step-by-step guidance to help dispute fraudulent charges, secure compromised accounts, and begin restoring your financial life. Coveron brings protection, insurance, and recovery assistance together in one service, helping you shop and live online with greater confidence. One scam can cost you everything, so protect yourself now. The first 100 users get 20% off with the code HISTORY20 at coveron.com/history20. That's code HISTORY20 at coveron.com/history20.
This episode is brought to you by PayPal. You had plans for the last days of summer, and back-to-school shopping has its own plans. School supplies, dorm essentials, your list doesn't stop. Neither does the spending. But when you pay in full with PayPal, you can pay over time. No interest, no fees. Check out with PayPal and get back to summer. Subject to approval. Learn more at paypal.com/payinfor. PayPal Inc. NMLS 910457.
While the Bismarck had gotten underway in time to, not be bombed, the fact that it had been spotted meant that the Royal Navy did know that an operation was happening and that the Bismarck was involved. Orders then went out for the Hood and the Prince of Wales, the two largest ships that were in a good position to deal with the Bismarck, to prepare for action. But there was one overriding problem that always had to be considered. The Royal Navy, as it was constructed in 1941, had a major range problem. As a fleet, it was designed around the idea that there would always be a British base somewhere close, due simply to the size of the British Empire, which spanned the entire globe. This had resulted in a few design decisions that would cause a tremendous number of headaches for Admiral Sir John Tovey, the officer in charge of the Home Fleet during the last half of May 1941. The most important headache was the fact that the British capital ships had, for the most part, a shocking lack of range when compared to the Bismarck. The Bismarck-class battleships were designed with a range of roughly 8,600 miles, or 14,000 kilometers, when they were traveling at 19 knots, which was far less than their maximum speed of 30 knots, but 19 knots was a good cruising speed. There's a huge difference in warships between their range at cruising speed and maximum speed. They go through fuel way faster when reaching that maximum speed. The Prince of Wales was part of the King George V class of British battleships. They were the newest and most powerful ships of the Royal Navy, and they had a range of 10,000 miles or 16,000 kilometers further than the Bismarck, but only when cruising at 10 knots. When their speed bumped up to the Bismarck cruising speed of 19 knots, their range would drop drastically. This optimal speed difference when it came to range was of course quite important while the Royal Navy ships were trying to chase down the Bismarck. They had to go quite quickly to do that, and that really cut down on their range. Now, if the Royal Navy had the ability to replenish its fuel reserves while at sea, that would have been helpful, but they did not have that capability. They lacked the fleet oilers that would have allowed for them to transfer fuel at sea, which meant that any time a ship needed more fuel, it had to head back to port. All that really could be done on the planning side for this was to hold the capital ships in port as long as possible, leave port with a maximum possible fuel load, and then try and use other resources to keep tabs on the course and speed of the German ships to allow for an optimal pursuit curve to be taken. The limitation of range would end up being a pivotal part of the story of the hunt for the Bismarck, and would completely shape almost every action taken by the Royal Navy's capital ships during the chase. And I bring it up now, and we spent a whole paragraph discussing it, because it is going to be a major plot point for the rest of the episodes in this series. The fuel situation meant that the man in command of the chase for the Bismarck, Admiral John Tovey, would hold back his resources until very firm information was available. Tovey had been in the Royal Navy for many years and had commanded a destroyer during the First World War. Then, during 1940, he had commanded the destroyer and cruiser squadrons in the Mediterranean Fleet, and had seen action in this role against the Italians during the early weeks of the war. He had then come back to the home islands and had been given command of the home fleet. When it was clear that the Bismarck had left Norway, Tovey made the decision to move his two capital ships, Hood and Prince of Wales, to Iceland, where they would immediately refuel. The move to Iceland put them in a better position to act regardless of which route the Germans decided to take to get into the Atlantic. But given the information that Tovey had about the German flights over the Denmark Strait, it seemed likely that they had been trying to determine if Royal Navy ships were present and the state of the ice in the strait, which could greatly alter the path required to successfully transit that strait and that route into the Atlantic. The two capital ships that were soon on their way to Iceland could not have been more different. The Hood, the mighty Hood, the largest ship in the Royal Navy built near the end of the First World War, and for 20 years could rightfully claim to be the most powerful naval ship afloat. It would be paired with the Prince of Wales, the newest of the King George V battleships, which had only recently been declared ready for action with the home fleet, even though the crew still required time for training. The Hood and the Prince of Wales would leave Scapa Flow at 11 p.m. on May 21st to make their way to Iceland, accompanied by 6 destroyers. They would be sailing under the designation Battle Cruiser Squadron 1, even though the Prince of Wales was technically not a battlecruiser. In terms of speed and armament, the Hood was the best match for the Bismarck, with the same 15-inch guns and roughly the same top speed as the Bismarck. However, behind those impressive top-line numbers, the Hood was an aging ship, with all of the challenges that were imposed upon a ship by that age. The Hood had been launched right near the end of the First World War, September 1918, and since that time, it had been the premier battlecruiser, the premier capital ship of the Royal Navy, and it was a battlecruiser. It wasn't a battleship. This meant that there were clear sacrifices that had been made to prioritize speed and range over armor, which left it in a vulnerable position as technology advanced, and other ships like the Bismarck were able to match its speed, range, and armament, but with much more armor to protect itself from incoming shell fire. There were also just many other problems with the Hood: loose rivets, worn plating, leaks, all the things that you would expect from a ship that was over 20 years old. Many of these problems could have been rectified with a major refit and modernization effort, similar to what had been done to some of the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships like Warspite. But this type of work was planned for the Hood, but the start of the war derailed those plans. There is some irony that the largest ship in the Royal Navy was left far weaker than it should have been, specifically because it was the largest ship and had been deprioritized for modernization efforts due to its importance as a ship that could go around the world to wave the flag of the Royal Navy. During the war, the men on board had to simply make do with the problems of age, and even with the issues, it still was quite imposing. The Prince of Wales was the opposite of the Hood, so new that its problems were that most of its systems and its men were completely untried. They were too young instead of too old. On paper, it appeared that the Prince of Wales was weaker than the Bismarck, with its smaller guns being part of the reason. The decision had been made during the design of the King George V battleships to give them 14-inch guns, even though it was known that other ships were using 15-inch and even 16-inch guns during the late 1930s, because there were 4 advantages to the 14-inch gun. The first was that a ship could have more of them, with the original plan for 12 14-inch guns being downsized to 10 for the final design, with the 4-2 turret situation on the King George V class being one of their defining features. The second advantage was that the 14-inch guns had a faster rate of fire, which meant that the ship had more chances to try and hit the enemy. And while at sea, sometimes just hitting the enemy with anything was difficult enough, and so having more tries at that was good. The third major benefit of the 14-inch guns was that they had a higher muzzle velocity, which was considered good for range and penetration power. And fourth, and really the most important advantage, was that the guns were faster to build and mount, and the British were more confident in their ability to use them. This fourth advantage was considered important because in 1937, when the first King George V's were laid down, speed of construction was considered to be essential. The Royal Navy had not built a battleship since the Nelson and Rodney in the 1920s, and with other navies rapidly building out their own capital ship fleets, the goal of the Royal Navy was to just start getting new battleships out as quickly as possible. Future planned battleships would be slated to mount larger guns, although they would never be built. The overriding concern for the King George V's was just to get them as quickly as possible. The design could be criticized, but it turned out that speed of construction was actually the most important factor for the Royal Navy in 1937, so they were not incorrect in prioritizing that over almost any other aspect of the design. Both the Prince of Wales and the King George V would be available in May 1941, and would both play a pivotal role in the hunt for the Bismarck. And it's possible that if other design decisions had been made, if bigger guns had been prioritized over speed of construction, one or both of them may not have been available when the Bismarck set sail. It's worth noting here that there were 2 battleships in the Royal Navy with guns larger than the Bismarck, the Nelson and the Rodney. Both mounted 16-inch guns, the largest in the Royal Navy. But their problem was that they were old and painfully slow, with a top speed of just 22 knots against roughly 30 for the Bismarck. They were also partially unavailable, with the Nelson in the South Atlantic after a stopover in Durban, South Africa, for some much-needed maintenance there, and the Rodney preparing for a trip from Scotland to Boston in the United States for a major refit. There was one other large ship available to Admiral Tovey as part of the home fleet when news arrived of the Bismarck, and that was the HMS Victorious. The Victorious was the newest aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy and had just received her first squadrons on May 16th, so only a couple days before the Bismarck set sail. Many of the pilots on board the Victorious had no combat experience, and the plan had been to train the crews of both the aircraft and the flight crews on the Victorious at the same time after it joined the fleet. But they were destined to be called into combat far earlier than anybody could have expected. Another interesting piece of news for the Bismarck story, although it's kind of off the beaten path here, is that as news circulated around the Admiralty and the higher reaches of the British government about the sightings of the German ships, news was specifically sent by Churchill across the Atlantic to the Americans. During this point in the war in spring 1941, America was still neutral, but the relationship that they had with the British had contributed to bring them closer and closer into the conflict. One of the ways that Roosevelt was working around some of the limitations imposed upon him by an isolationist Congress was by working on some naval agreements that would allow the British to free up more resources of the Royal Navy to focus on the tasks that they needed to be doing. This would result in the following telegram being sent to Roosevelt from Churchill on May 23rd. Quote, "Yesterday, 21st, Bismarck, Prinz Eugen, and 8 merchant ships were located in Bergen. Low cloud cover prevented air attack. Tonight, we find they have sailed. We have reason to believe that a formidable Atlantic raid is intended. Should we fail to catch them going out, your Navy should surely be able to mark them down for us. King George V, Prince of Wales, Hood, Repulse, and aircraft carrier Victorious with ancillary vessels will be on their track. Give us news, and we will finish the job." End quote. When this message was received, the battleship USS Texas was already positioned about 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers south of the Denmark Strait, and the U.S. Navy had already been operating in such a way that it would interfere with possible resupply efforts of the German ships. The one great weakness of the German resupply at sea strategy for its surface raiders was that during the actual resupply, the ships were very vulnerable, and so just having more vessels out at sea, be it the U.S. Navy or anybody else, increased the likelihood of a resupply effort being interrupted. The U.S. Navy was not going to engage the Bismarck. They weren't going to fire at the Bismarck or any German ship at this period. But they had a radio, and they planned to use it to let certain people know, like those of the Royal Navy, that by golly, there's some German ships out here. You guys should come check that out. All of these actions on the British side, preparing their ships, sending their ships out to sea, informing the Americans, all of that was unknown to Lütjens and the men aboard the German ships. On May 22nd, they would be informed about some good news when they heard about the German invasion of Crete and the information that naval intelligence believed that the Royal Navy's Force H, which was based in Gibraltar, was going to reinforce the Royal Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean during the continuing crisis on Crete. This would hopefully reduce the strength of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic, which of course played into the hands of Lütjens and the Bismarck. This news reinforced the decision to make immediately for the Denmark Strait, but it was still a minor factor compared to the weather reports that Lütjens was getting, including from the fleet meteorologist, which advised that a high speed was required to make it through the Denmark Strait before the weather broke, which would allow the British to see the ships more easily. Lütjens would place the fleet speed at 24 knots, higher than normal cruising speed, but the speed that he believed was necessary to make it through the strait in time. They were racing towards the Denmark Strait, but unfortunately for the future of the German ships, they were about to run directly into the ships that were destined to be their companions on the rest of their journey. Because in the Denmark Strait were waiting the cruisers HMS Suffolk and Norfolk, which were about to play the most important role in the Royal Navy's efforts to find and sink the Bismarck.